thankful that people are joining us at Lake Erie Yearly Meetings 2020 Annual Sessions. This afternoon, Gretel Van Wieren has prepared a presentation on connecting with nature as a spiritual practice. And Gretel, I think it'd probably be best if you introduce yourself, since I am not as familiar with your work at Michigan State University. Please take it away.
All right, well, thank you so much for the invitation to Susan Hartman and the organizing group. And I was fortunate enough to give a talk on nature connection at the Red Cedar Friends meeting in East Lansing back in February at their winter gathering. And Susan was part of that meeting and then invited me to this meeting. So I'm very glad to be back among friends. Time with the Quakers is probably one of the most fondest spiritual memories I have. When my husband and I worshiped at Ithaca Friends meeting in Ithaca, New York, and the New Haven Friends meeting in New Haven, Connecticut for several years. And so it's wonderful to be back among friends. So just in terms of a brief introduction, I teach at Michigan State University. I've taught there for the past 10 years. I am also clergy in the Reformed Church of America, which is the church of my heritage, and served as a parish pastor in upstate New York for several years before going back for my doctorate, which is in religious ethics and specifically focused on environmental issues and nature spirituality. And the courses I teach at Michigan State focus on religion, ethics, and the environment, and then also nonprofit leadership around community-based engagement with social and environmental issues. So the points that I wanted to touch on today are based on, or based in part on my latest book, which is, you can see here on the screenshot, Listening at Lookout Creek, Nature and Spiritual Practice. And in that book, I really focused on two places thinking about nature connection. One was when I was writer in residence at the H.J. Andrews Experimental Forest in the Western Cascade Mountains of Oregon. And the Andrews Forest is the most studied primal forest in North America. And so scientists and scholars and researchers there study ecological dynamics of old growth forests spanning 200 years. And so they engage in these long-term ecological study sites. And part of their project involves humanists, artists, poets, creative writers to reflect on the forest and the research that they're doing on, say, log decomposition of old growth species and the spotted owl, and reflect on those kinds of environmental issues from a more humanistic and artistic perspective. So that's part of what the book is, my time at the Andrews and having the privilege to be immersed into these really amazing research sites that have been going on for a very long time. And then the other part of the book oscillates between my own childhood experiences of connection with nature growing up in Michigan, and specifically in northern Michigan at my family's cabin in the Manistee National Forest, and reflecting on the meaning that that had for me, and then also now as a parent of three 20, 18 and 15-year-old children, and what it means to try to connect with nature spiritually in these hyper high-tech, fast-paced, wild kind of times that we find ourselves in. And of course, this has taken on new meaning with the pandemic and so forth. So, so my talk touches on points from the book, but just also from my own life experience when I think about what kind of practices really are important and significant for helping us to connect in meaningful ways with the natural world. And so when the book first came out, my editor at Oregon State University asked if I would write a short blog post or essay to help publicize the book. And then she said, well, how about you write a listicle? And I had no idea what a listicle was, but I was intrigued. And it turns out a listicle is really just a fancy kind of high-tech name for a list. So I enjoyed doing it though. And so I thought today I would offer a kind of listicle of 6 kind of practices that I have found over the years, and also in my reading of spiritual writings and teaching on nature spiritualities, that I found over the years to be a kind of significance for my own self, but also to be a thread that runs through spiritual writings on nature connection. And so before I say that though, I want to point out that before I go through the 7 things, I want to point out that, of course, spiritual connection with nature and spiritually connecting with nature is not at all a new idea. The idea of nature as a source of divine revelation, or of connecting with nature as a way to purify the mind, or as a way to connect with nature to gain some sort of spiritual insight about oneself or about one's calling or work in the world, is an ancient one. We find themes of this in each of the global religious traditions, of course, in different ways, with different meanings and so on and so forth, but it's not a new one. And then the second thing I just want to point out before getting into the listicle is, I think that during these pandemic times, I just want to recognize that not everyone is able to be outside right now. Some people are able to be outside a lot more than they would have, but others, because of their locales, because of their physical health, because of wanting to keep others safe and so forth, have been confined indoors much more than perhaps they would have normally. So I want to recognize that, since I'm really focusing on spending time outdoors, that not everyone is able to do that right now. And then finally, I just want to note during these pandemic times that I myself have found it at times overwhelming to hear about all the amazing things, that people are doing in and on behalf of the natural world, to the point, planting gigantic gardens and going on marathon long hikes every day, and just these very ambitious things that people are achieving, which is incredibly admirable and inspiring. But I just want to say, when I'm going through this list of 7 things, of course we don't do them all at once, and sometimes we don't do spiritual practices in nature or otherwise very often. And so I just want to preface it by saying that I hope that the list sparks something in you, either resonates with something you've been doing, or maybe gives you some new ideas of something to try. But again, I just want to preface it by saying that. So the first spiritual practice I have for connecting with nature stems from my teaching experience at Michigan State. And this is a class that I've taught at Michigan State for going on 10 years. And it's called Religion and the Environment. And it's an undergraduate course. And one of the things that we do early on in the course is read the 1862 essay by Henry David Thoreau called Walking. And it's listed here. You can see in the Atlantic, it was published posthumously. If you're interested if you haven't read it and are interested, if you Google Walking Thoreau, at least on my Google search, it's the first thing that will come up, is this link to the Atlantic article. It's free, it's online. I would encourage you to read it if it's something that sounds intriguing to you. But so we read this piece early on in the class, and Thoreau talks about walking as one of his main forms of spiritual practice, walking in the natural world. And he writes that he can't imagine walking less than 4 hours a day and remaining kind of healthy spiritually and fulfilled. And so he talks about the spiritual practice of walking, preferably away from town, he writes, and uses just this very beautiful spiritual language to talk about his walks in the natural world. And so, of course, students are surprised and a little bit shocked about the idea of walking 4 hours a day, and they think it's terribly unrealistic in modern life, and which it is, right, for most of us. But so then the next class, I have them go on their own kind of Thoreauvian walkabout. And I tell them that they don't have to go for 4 hours, that they can go for 15 minutes. I tell them several natural lands in and around Michigan State's campus. We have a beautiful horticultural campus, so there are a lot of natural lands on campus. And I give them some ideas of some more solitary woodlots and places they could walk, or if they live off campus and commute, maybe find some place that's a little bit more off the beaten path to walk, and go for 15 minutes. That's their assignment, and leave their eye thingies at home and to go by themselves. And afterward to write a 1-page essay about what they saw, what they felt, what they heard, what surprised them, what annoyed them, just anything really that comes to mind when they're on this little walk. Now, what surprises me is that in the 10 years that I've had students do this, and I have them do it twice in the semester, once at the very beginning and once at the end to do a kind of comparative reflection, is that I have never received a negative essay on this experience, despite the fact that it's mandatory, that I ask them not to bring their phones or technology, to go by themselves. Many, if not most of them, this is their first time walking in silence alone without technology in this kind of way. And if it's not their first time, it's something that they did in childhood and haven't really done since then. So these are some essays this semester on the second walking exercise. This is when we had already been sent home for quarantine off campus. And so they did their second walkabout wherever they were for the stay-at-home order. We weren't on campus. We were doing online learning at that point. And so this is some of the things that students wrote this semester, that the idea that I'm happy to have the space and free time to reflect on my current condition, remind myself there are still so many things for me to look forward to. So these kind of times of reflection after being in quarantine. This week I walked across the huge and beautiful Michigan State campus. It was very quiet and empty due to the COVID-19 pandemic. I was reflecting in my head how the pandemic has turned the world upside down. Are there messages from nature? And so these very really moving essays that the students write about the meaning of just walking in nature. The kids climbed the balance on fallen trees, got completely lost, just enjoyed the peacefulness that comes around wandering in the woods. Amidst all the craziness going on, the best parts of our days have been when we were able to escape outside and just enjoy being together. This was a student who had 3 children. So that's the first kind of spiritual practice I wanted to talk about, is walking in nature as a form of spiritual practice. And again, not necessarily 4 hours a walk. Oftentimes I'll just walk around, slowly walk around my backyard and use it as a time for spiritual reflection. So the second practice I wanted to talk about is sitting meditation outside. This is something that I did often as a parish pastor, and my practice was to walk and walk until I felt compelled to sit down. And sometimes it would be on a fallen log, sometimes it would be on a bench if I was walking in an area with a bench, sometimes it would just be in the grass, or in a garden chair that was sitting by the house. And you know well as Quakers that there are many different methods for sitting meditation or contemplation or prayer, and depending on one's tradition, depending on one's practice. One that I find outside helpful is finding an object near to me to just focus on: a leaf, a blade of grass, a branch, and then come up with a short phrase or a word even to quiet my mind. And so sitting meditation outside or sitting prayer outside is a practice that I wanted to raise. I wanted to read something from an experience I had when I was at the Andrews Forest, and this really leads into my third practice I wanted to reference, which is attentive observation of the aspects and creatures and organisms and natures. But so I wanted to write on a time when I went out at the Andrews with the intention of engaging in sitting meditation outdoors, and wound up having this observational experience with, I write here a salamander, but I actually came to find out when I got back to the little place I was staying that it was a rough-skinned newt. And being from Michigan, I hadn't had as many encounters with these newts, which are very large and different looking, but I did learn that it was a newt. And so I just want to read from this in terms of, again, what became a sitting meditation, but in a relationship with another organism. So I've always loved these creatures, salamanders. As a child, my 3 younger sisters and I would turn over logs again and again in pursuit of them. We wouldn't keep them typically, we just wanted to see them. Log after log we would turn. There would be deep, dark blue with light gray spots, brown, black with orangey dots, and those feet with such tiny toes, body soft and sticky and slick all at the same time. This salamander is brown, dull, and fat, with no discernible spots or sheen. Not at all like the salamanders from my upbringing in Michigan. It sits completely still in the middle of the road. I lie down on the road and put my face next to it. I can see the undercarriage of its mouth moving. It is lined with a hair-thin line of orange. I try to keep my head down, but my eyes begin to spin from the angle. I sit up and decide to wait it out. I will stay still as long as it does. Certainly I can out-meditate a salamander. I sit and watch. I think about cougars, then about the adaptive purpose of meditation. Going on 10 minutes and Big Brown has still not moved a muscle. It is doing that because it thinks I'm a predator, I conclude, plain dead. Perhaps meditation does the same for humans. It helps us survive in the most difficult of circumstances. When we are close to death, we turn to time-tested spiritual practices, have funerals and burials, sing, eat, dance, pray, hold hands. Not anymore, sadly. We know from neuroscientists that the brains of nuns and monks who are serious meditators look different than most. It does not matter what religion they follow. What matters is the significant time they spend in devoted, focused silence. So again, that was a time when I went out intent on sitting meditation, and then encountered the newt on the road where I was walking. So that's the third practice that I wanted to highlight, was a focus on attentive observation of the different creatures and organisms and aspects of the natural world. And at times, this attentive observation can take on a scientific quality, but I want to highlight more of a appreciative or curiosity that can come out on trying to pay attention to maybe something that we might have otherwise overlooked, or maybe something that surprises us, or maybe we just tell ourselves, okay, today I'm going to pull back a little bit of soil and see what's there. I listened to a wonderful interview during the Black Birders events that National Public Radio was hosting, and a prominent ornithologist that was interviewed for one of the events they were hosting had a really wonderful and profound message when he said that a lot of times birders become so obsessed with learning the names, either scientific or common names of birds, but he said, don't worry so much about doing that. The birds know their names, and worry about learning their patterns and what do you really like about it, and where are they flying, and who are they teaming up with, and do they fly high or low, and do they like water, and do they come for insects, where, what times, and really learning more about the kind of broader picture of birds and why he himself fell in love with birds. And so I thought that was a really profound statement. Also, I love Robin Wall-Kimmerer on this topic. She is a indigenous ecologist, and she's written some wonderful books, most recently Braiding Sweetgrass If you don't know Kimmer's work, check it out. She's just absolutely fascinating. I'm going to reference her a little bit later here in the conversation too. But in one of her books called Gathering Mosses, which is a treatment of mosses from her scientific ecological perspective, but also indigenous perspective and natural historical perspective. She studies mosses. That's her, one of her specialties. And in it, she writes, similarly to the ornithologist, that there are so many unbelievable number of species of mosses. Don't worry about trying to name them, because as an amateur, it's actually very difficult. I tried at the Andrews to do some moss identification, and it was extremely difficult. So I wound up giving up after I identified maybe 15 species, because there's so many mosses in the old growth forest. I did what she did, and I started trying to remember the mosses from my upbringing. We, as a child, used moss a lot to build forts and roofs on forts and mattresses on the floor and all sorts of things with mosses. So I started naming mosses after certain childhood memories. And also just what I remember it looking like and feeling like. Starry top moss is one that is up at the cabin a lot. Moss from the tree fort was another one, a denser, kind of heavier moss. And so again, this idea of observing specific aspects or organisms or processes or changes in nature as a form of spiritual practice that also creates a kind of attentiveness in our consciousness and in our bodies, is the next practice that I wanted to emphasize. And then I wanted to think a little bit about, when we think about observation, we're mostly talking about observation with our eyes, sometimes with our hands to feel things, if that's appropriate. But then I also want to talk about, for the fourth kind of spiritual practice for connecting with nature, the idea of listening. And this is an idea that I think, especially with sitting meditation and walking meditation, becomes pronounced, especially when one is meditating and sitting meditation outside or walking quietly and slowly. My family heritage, I grew up spending a lot of time hunting and fishing in northern Michigan, and at least in northern Michigan, if one is hunting white-tailed deer, which is a prominent species where I grew up, one spends a lot of time sitting in silence in blinds or tree stands and listening intensely for the animals that are around one, to the point that one listens so hard for small animal movements that the woods becomes a kind of cacophony of noises that one might not ever notice without sitting very, very still for quite a long time. And so for me, that from my upbringing was something that kind of heightened my sense of hearing and listening. I wanted to read something from that section in my book where I wrote about hunting with my daughter Inga several years ago when she was a younger teenager. And hunting with children presents its own kind of challenges, but also its own kind of practices in terms of this intense focus on silence. So when Inga and I arrive at the blind on opening morning, it is still night. An hour later comes dawn, followed by songbirds and squirrels. Now we have something to do. For a while, we listen to a boisterous, tufted titmouse squawking away. Inga looks up from her book and whispers, "That's kind of annoying." I grin with my head still in my book. A red-headed woodpecker appears, turning round and round the tree, pecking each side for food. A ruffed grouse fools us for an approaching deer. Squirrel snaps twigs and rustle leaves, jumping from branch to branch, squealing with delight over all the acorns. At one wild squirrel breakout, Inga and I look at each other with wide-eyed horror at their bizarre-sounding antics. At noon, Inga says that she has had enough. "I'm hungry," she says. "Can we go back?" Sure, let's just get a quick lunch, I say, stressing the quick. After lunch, Inga asks whether we could go out into town for fudge. Don't you think we should go back to the blind, I ask, trying not to sound too pushy. After fudge, she says without a doubt. That way we'll have more energy to sit. When we return from town, the temperature has warmed to nearly 50 degrees. Do I have to put all these clothes on again? Inga asks. I'm going to be boiling in the blind. You'll be surprised how chilly it is going to be once the sun goes down and you're sitting still, I tell her. Put it all on. You can always take off a layer if you need to. On the walk back to the blind, we half expect to scare a deer. The light breaking through the sky and trees is so perfect. Once we settle into our folding chairs and zip the blind shut, I tell Inga that we are not leaving until dark, as if this will become lodged into her consciousness and make it so. We read to the hum of bees. For a while, I think we have set up on a hive, so loud is the buzzing. The squirrels are at it again. Inga rolls her eyes and nudges me, pointing to factoids in the National Geographic Weird But True book she found on the cabin bookshelves. So I think that just highlights the kind of way in which listening can also open our consciousness to the others in our midst, to the community of life all around us, and especially when we're focused on listening, which is another, I think, orientation. The fifth practice that I want to highlight is participating in the natural world. And with our whole selves, I don't know if some of you have been gardening more outside. Restoration work is another thing that I have studied in terms of how land restoration becomes a kind of spiritual practice for people to connect with the natural world in a way that that allows people to attempt to participate with natural processes, ecological processes. This is a restoration project that I worked with in Vermont, the Lewis Creek watershed, where they were attempting to restore a stream bed, but then also do a lot of activities around connecting the local community with their watershed through restoration and the kind of active participation in nature that can become a kind of spiritual practice if one thinks of it in that way. And this other photo on the right is a prairie restoration I participated in Philo, Illinois, when we lived there, and where we converted about 25 acres around the children's elementary school into prairie, the rest of which was corn and soybeans surrounding the elementary school. So we worked to convert this little prairie area in Philo, Illinois. And again, the way in which participating in the natural world through restoration or gardening, even the way in which something like being reflective on our eating and how we participate in the natural world for food. And so Robin Kimmer, Wal Kimmer, who I referenced a minute ago with Gathering Mosses, she gave an address at the Natural History Museum in New York, sponsored by the Center for Humans and Nature. In it, she retells the creation story from her indigenous heritage, and she focuses in the end on talking about the way in which attitudes of reciprocity and gratitude, those are the two principles that she underscores in indigenous worldview that she thinks have incredibly important meaning for also non-indigenous communities when it comes to thinking about climate change and restoring this kind of mutuality between humans and the non-human world, reciprocity and gratitude. And she talks about those things as we as humans participating in the natural world and receiving and giving back and giving thanks for all of the tiny gifts that nature gives us at literally every millisecond of our lives. And so I think those ideas of reciprocity and gratitude are incredibly important that Kimmer points out when it comes to participating in the natural world. And then the last practice that I want to talk about, I should mention with participation, we also have play in the natural world. Something that we as adults sometimes forget about, but of course, if we have children, they kind of force us to do that, even when we don't want to. And Thoreau, too, talked about how he just couldn't understand why when people grew up, they didn't climb trees anymore. Which for a while I tried to convince my students to do that on campus, but that was way too far out the comfort zone for college students to be climbing trees in the middle of campus, for most of them. So we don't do that anymore. But just thinking about play in the natural world and how immersing ourselves in those ways of trying to have fun. And of course, it doesn't have to be like this, because most of us can't do that anymore. But these are my daughter and cousins jumping off a dune in Michigan a couple years ago. But play in the natural world is a form of participating, I think, is also a spiritual practice, to really learn, even in the most challenging of times, that there can still be laughter. And not all the time, but there can still be laughter and the joy of kind of playing in nature that provides a kind of unique practice. And then the final practice that I wanted to highlight is one that Quakers are well aware of too, and that's acting on behalf of nature. And I think this is a tricky one, because we as humans think we know what's, at times we think we know what's right on behalf of nature, and sometimes we get it right and sometimes we don't get it right. But this is the idea of speaking out on behalf of the natural world, when the natural world can't speak in the same language that we as humans do. And obviously in these times, with the issues of environmental justice and climate justice and racial justice that is at the very forefront of our thinking about this. But many feminist theologians and philosophers talk about a spirituality of resistance, and the way in which activism too is a form of spiritual practice. And so the other practices that I had referenced, I spoke of them in more solitary terms, other than perhaps the restoration and the restoration work and the playfulness. But of course, each of the practices can be done collectively and communally. And I'm sure many of you have done one or all of these practices with groups of Quakers or with other folks. And so I just want to underscore too, along with activism as a form of spirituality and a spirituality of resistance, the fact that each of these practices can and perhaps should in many instances be thought of in collective terms. And of course, we're rethinking all of that now with all of the COVID issues that we're dealing with in terms of how to create community and so on and so forth. So those are the practices that I wanted to highlight. And then I just want to note in closing too, before I wanted to do some breakout groups and smaller groups to think about a couple of questions I had for each of you to think of. But I just wanted to notice too that when we think about walking meditation, sitting meditation, observation, listening, that I think there's been a tendency in spiritual writing about nature to focus on the aspects of beauty and wonder and those more positive kind of aspects. But I also just want to say that of course when one engages in these things is revealed the underside of nature, the suffering, the death, the predation. One thing when I was at the old growth forest for the writing residency, one of the study sites that was at the residency was a site where they had been studying log decomposition in the old growth forest, and they would study things like carbon sequestration and all different dynamics of decay and rot. And one scientist called it the study of trying to think of the morticulture and the study of that. And I have to tell you, walking into that study site with all of these dead logs with PCV piping coming out of them, so scientists with the dead logs almost breathing into the rest of the forest, it really, you know, made me realize that focusing on the chapter in the book I called Good Death, because that's such a hard thing to think of. Is that even a good term to use, I wonder? And I'm not talking about the death that doesn't have to be, the injustices of death, but the death that has to be, the suffering that has to be, that's built into the system, into biological life. And how do we think about that as spiritual people? And I think that the natural world too, in observing and listening and immersing ourselves in these ways, however we can, also can give us insight and even some solace about something that I think for most of us is very scary. And so I just want to point that out as a kind of final note, because that's a theme too in the book and just in my work that I've thought quite a bit about and have been thinking about quite a lot now in these times. So thank you for being here and for participating. And now I just, for breakout rooms, are we good with breakout rooms? Mark, Susan?
Yeah, Bill will,
or sorry, Bill.
Yeah. Oops.
So these are the
Yes,
questions.
I'm thinking we will have 7 groups. So that'll give
Okay.
us like 6 or 7 people in a group.
Okay, great. So what I want each group to do is to take 6 or 7 in a group. So if we could take about 20 minutes, I'm thinking about maybe 20 to 25 minutes. And if someone in your group, or if each of you could just be mindful of each sharing 3 to 4 minutes, so everyone can share, and think a little bit about these 3 questions. And you don't have to talk about all of them, but have you been spending more or less time outdoors these days? Is there an activity, and maybe there are many activities, but maybe just focus on maybe one activity outdoors. Or maybe if you're not able to go outdoors for whatever reason, is there a window you like sitting at that's facing outdoors? Or is there a plant that you've enjoyed inside? Or maybe there are other forms of vicarious nature connection, maybe media. Maybe there are certain television shows. So it doesn't have to be outdoors necessarily, but are there nature-oriented activities that have been especially helpful to you in these difficult times? And then are there any kind of spiritual insight that activity has given for you? I know those are a lot of questions. If you want to just focus on, is there a nature-based activity?
Susan, could you post those in the chat?
Yes, I can do that. So post all these questions in the chat?
Before we break into groups, we'll be able to see it if we get it in there before we leave.
Yes, exactly. So if then you could post your responses in the chat, that's perfect, Bill. So then if you could post your responses in the chat, either you can have one person who's kind of typing in chat in the breakout room, or you can just each, you know, in Zoom, there's that button where you can just push that says chat. I know for me, I was not familiar with Zoom before the whole pandemic, so someone had to show me how to do that and where the button was. So if you feel comfortable pressing the chat button at the bottom of the screen and just sharing your thoughts as you're talking, or maybe someone in the group who feels comfortable could kind of write up your thoughts as you're chatting. So let's take 20 minutes to do that, and then we'll reconvene for a couple of minutes at the end, and I can read the chatting that's going on too. So that would be wonderful.
Okay, so thank you, Greta. We're going to go ahead and break into, it looks like 8 groups of 4 to 5. Will give us a little more time to talk.
Great.
So I'm going to try that.
Perfect.
Here we go.
Thank you.
So people have to accept the invite to go to their breakout room. They'll see a choice pop up for them. So John, you'll have to say yes to joining your group, and Linda and Mark, you should see, you might be a little tab that says Breakout Rooms that you would have to click on and then accept or join. Looks like breakout room number 2. I'm going to move. Okay. So people are coming back.
Great.
So many Quaker faces. It's kind of like that picture of Quaker Action you showed us earlier.
Exactly, right? I loved it. I thought about just like doing one of the sites, but then I loved the whole image that came up when I Googled the whole thing. I thought that was wonderful.
We didn't have very long. I don't think we had a full 20 minutes. I want to go back.
Sorry there, David. I might be getting tired from sitting today. I need to get up and move. But it's good that you're with us.
If you have reconvened and you're back in the group, if you might just type in the chat something that you said in the group, or if not, that's fine. But if you want to now so we can all see it, that would be great.
That sounds good. Peggy's asking if her sharing during the breakout group is visible here. It's not. So you can send this to everyone, and we'll see your lying on the lawn. That sounds nice. Accepting the backyard woodchuck.
Oh my, I have yet to do that too.
Wow. Somebody gave us a good summary. Swimming, that sounds really good. Somebody's making up songs to the birds. They're singing back. What kind of creature will they think you are?
So Bill, are we all back together now?
We are.
Okay. Wonderful. Has everyone had a chance to type something in? Yeah, please keep typing, and I'm reading them, thinking of, when we reconvene here, I just want to comment on a couple of things that some of you have been writing that's making me realize, I think one way of connection with nature too is the talking to, and the conversing with either creatures or plants. Some of you talked about, and also hearing plants speak to you. So what comes to mind is Julia Butterfly, who stood in Luna, the redwood, or sat in Luna, the redwood, for I think 900 days, and she said that she really did begin to hear the tree speak with her. And of course, we have that idea of agency in the natural world and various spiritual traditions where people talk to either animals or plants or flowers in the natural world and hear them speak back to them. In Christian tradition, of course, we have St. Francis of Assisi, but others, this aspect of communication and talking to and being talked to, maybe not in the same way we think about the word talk, but this kind of communication between ourselves and the natural world. So thanks for noting that. That's a wonderful listening and talking to the plants and animals. And then I was also thinking, based on some of your comments, you've talked about kind of submitting to the ways of nature that maybe aren't quite agreeable to things that you want to do in nature. So I've been spending the whole summer trying to get the squirrels off my bird feeders, and the woodchucks too. We've got a lot of woodchucks at our house, which dig holes in places that I wish they wouldn't, but figuring out how to kind of live mutually with a lot of woodchucks. So I resonate with that. Desert Solitaire, I saw one of you write about with Ed Abbey, a wonderful book. I'm so glad you brought that up. A wonderful book I'm reading right now, that's just a beautiful kind of feminist contemporary rendering of Ed Abbey's Desert Solitaire, is Amy Irvine's Trespass. I actually have it right on my desk right now. Trespass, Living at the Edge of the Promised Land. And she also has a wonderful piece in the environmental literature magazine, Orion, right now. But Amy Irvine's Trespass, Living at the Edge of the Promised Land, I would highly recommend if you liked Edward Abbey's Desert Solitaire. It's just a wonderful kind of contemporary desert solitaire book that I'm kind of in the middle of right now. Oh, and I love this one too, about the mock orange blossoms and the perfume and the smells of the natural world. I'm actually right now up at my in-laws on Lake Superior on the South Shore in northern Wisconsin, and we were just commenting on how the smells where we are right now are different from the smells that we know back home in Michigan, and how smells too, this is something I think about in my book, is how smells really trigger memory for us in a way that's very pronounced, and in evolutionary ways, the way that smells kind of get into the layers of our memory and are lodged very, very deep at the bases of our memory, and how they trigger those kinds of emotions, both good and bad, but smells in the natural world. So I love that. So this last count, maybe if I listened more to my plants, I'd be able to keep them alive a little longer, the house plants. I can resonate with that too. I don't know if there's a way, Bill, if anyone has any comment or wants to raise their hand and
Sure.
make any comment or have any questions or anything, just for a couple of minutes here, and then we'll end and hopefully spend some time outside, since we've been sitting here for a while.
So people can feel free to unmute themselves and ask a question.
Okay, great. So if you want to unmute yourself and ask a question or make a comment or anything really at this point.
Who have we got?
Hello, Gretel. I've been wondering, in your experience with your MSU students, how much feedback, if any, if you've gotten from any of your students whose experience is urban and exclusively urban, or Black or brown minorities? That's likely to be quite different.
I think that's a wonderful point. And of course, at Michigan State, it's a wonderful place to kind of learn about that, because it's, you know, public in the capital P. And so we really are a incredible microcosm of the state of Michigan. Most of my undergraduate students do come from Michigan, and a large majority come from Detroit and Metro Detroit. And so have that either more intensely urban or suburban kind of experience. And Michigan State, maybe some of you know, has the largest population of first generation college students among the Big Ten universities. And so we have those discussions all the time. And on the one hand, I think people's experiences are very different, that either just in general, students' experiences are incredibly different because they come from all over the state, from very rural areas, from very urban areas. But I think in particular, if you know your question with African American or Black and brown students, surprisingly, when we go on the nature walk, that's kind of an equalizing experience, in that people, of course, write very differently about their experiences, but also we do a lot of exercises around whether there are particular places, either from their upbringing or places they visited, where they felt a special connection with nature. And even the most urban of students, and even again, can name a place that they felt some sort of positive connection with the natural world in a way that was meaningful. Now, saying that, on the other hand, I last summer, for the first time with my husband, led a study away program to Hawaii, and we did a lot of very hands-on, intensive work outdoors restoration work in the sun and in the heat and that kind of outdoor work. Some of the students were very comfortable with that kind of thing based on their experience, and many of the students were not, and hadn't had kind of exposure to doing work outdoors in the natural world. But I do have to say, in terms of just being able to speak to some sort of positive feeling of connection with the natural world, the diversity of students, again, vastly different experiences, vastly different ways of talking about that. But most, if not all of the students that I've had have been able to find some semblance of being outdoors that's been meaningful and connective. But of course, a huge diversity.
David Fink has his hand up.
Yes.
2 quick comments. I would call people's attention to recent mailings from the Sierra Club. Every email I've gotten in the last couple of weeks has had a standard statement about how they are acknowledging that the environmental movement over the last century and a quarter has been predominantly white and in some cases overtly racist, and detailing some of the affirmative action that they are taking to overcome that. So if you want to talk about intersectionality, pay attention to what Sierra Club is saying. The other is recalling an outing of from a very urban co-op school that my daughter was part of, and we went to a farm that was run by Quakers. And one of the things they had us do was go sit in a little wooded glade and simply be quiet for 15 minutes. None of the other kids had ever done that. And it kind of blew their mind to listen to the trees and to not have to work with words. And I think it was transformational for a number of kids who were afraid first to go out. The sounds in the night, that first night, were very scary to them, different than the sounds of the city. Thank you.
I find my hand up, so after somebody talks, go ahead, Claire. I didn't mean to interrupt you, but at some point, go ahead.
Oh, yeah, I think you have to be careful not to stereotype people. There are lots. In fact, almost all the Black people I know have a lot of experience with outdoors. You don't have to be in the country to have experience. I grew up in the suburbs of Philadelphia. My mother had a half-acre garden. And I was used to going out every morning and picking wild strawberries out the back of her garden because somebody had planted those. There are a lot of, even in urban areas, I know a lot of Black kids have pets, and in a way that's in touch with nature. They're very attached to cats. I have a lot of patients that found a kitten or a puppy or a snake or a turtle or something like that, and they're very attached and connected with. There's parks. When I lived in the Philadelphia area, Fairmount Park is one of the biggest parks in the nation. A lot of kids like to go to parks here in Pittsburgh. A lot of Black kids like to go to the park. The park is a big draw for lots of kids. So I think you have to be a little bit careful about stereotyping. Now, there are some things that I know that Black people in general don't have experience, things like wild water rafting and stuff like that. And maybe northern Black kids don't have much access to farms. Although you have to be careful when talking about southern Black kids, where it may be the opposite, where they may have quite a bit of experience with farms. So there's, here in Pittsburgh, there's a whole culture that's grown up around urban gardening, urban farming, and in the Black community. So there's a lot of that. So because we have such food deserts, and a group of Black women got together and got the idea, there's all these empty lots, let's grow food. And so now you see all these people in the summer, you go through Homewood and in almost every block you see somebody hawking vegetables they sold in their urban garden. So you have to be a little bit careful with stereotyping people. For myself, I'll just say real quickly, I haven't, other than watching Cardinals, which are a small group, we talk out I have a bay window in my living room. Most of this thing has mostly elicited experiences myself as a child. I used to sing to ladybugs because there was a poem that said, ladybug, ladybug, fly away home, your house is on fire. I really believed it, so I would catch ladybugs and sing to them. And I felt a real kinship with them. And ants, I used to lie on the ground and talk to ants and follow them and encourage them with their load that they were carrying and make up stories. I used to also look for salamanders. We found toads. And then I had a tree. To this day, I love maple trees. The maple tree outside my window. And I used to read it poetry that I wrote. And the tree and I had a relationship. And I'll never forget, I was 10 years old and I came home from school. My father had chopped that tree down. To this day, I'm still mourning the death of that tree. So.
Dorothy?
Yes, I guess I'd like to consider feeling insignificant as a spiritual experience, because when I think about the places where I'm really with nature, I think about the giant redwoods, and I went there the day after the election in 2016, and I just, my relatives asked me, what I wanted to do that day since we were all in mourning, and I said that I wanted to go to the redwoods, so we did. And of course, you can hear the redwoods. I mean, they speak very clearly. They got big voices, and you just feel so insignificant standing there. But I think of other natural places. You can't see my t-shirt, but it has the Colorado mountains on it. And I think about going to the ocean where there's a rocky coast. And those are the places that I really want to be. I enjoy pastoral settings and the rolling hills here back east, but the places that I just mentioned are where I just feel a spiritual awe with nature. So maybe somebody else can reflect on that feeling of insignificance as a human being in the grandeur of nature. And I guess maybe I feel like it's telling me there's something enduring, that no matter how bad humans mess up, that nature's there and extremely powerful.
I thought Helen from Red Cedar was going to say something too, but maybe I'm mistaken.
I hear you.
First of all, Claire, I apologize. I didn't know how to put my hand up, but actually part of what you already said, that, there has been, and unfortunately it took an unfortunate incident to get it going, of writings that, yes, African Americans out in the woods and they're recreating. Of course, you talk about the rural South as well. But there's been also a dialogue in the Audubon Society after the Central Park incident, because the gentleman was a board member of the New York Audubon. Even though I have to say, on the personal level, I thought maybe there was something more. It was just as an racist thing, that maybe she's had some mental illness issues. But it really got a lot of feedback, a lot of discussion going in the Audubon Society, which is still going today. And there were some people that were writing in, oh, we just want to watch birds. We don't want to get involved in politics. And I can't think of the name of the neighborhood right now, but there was an African-American neighborhood that was destroyed. There was a poor neighborhood destroyed to build Central Park. Because if it had been a white neighborhood or a wealthy neighborhood, they would have been able to pay lawyers to stop it from happening. But I also had a question for Gretel as a person on campus, and I find this just in my small town, not just a sensitive of being distracted, separated from nature, but from people. I can't say hi to anybody when I pass them now because everyone has headphones on. And I think not only do we not hear each other, but we don't hear, the birds or the wind blowing. And that's, that's here in my small town, not just on a college campus. So I wonder, has there been any disconnecting trends that you've noticed that at least your students have taken part in after taking your course?
You mean from other people?
Well, just in terms of students walking around on campus.
Yeah, I know. That's and on their phones and.
Or after they take your class, are they unplugging more?
I don't know if they're unplugging more, but I think they're maybe hopefully a little bit more aware of it. I actually ban technology in my classes, which in the beginning is kind of unpopular, and you always have, typically the white male who in the back who says, no, I'm not doing this, and sits on their computer the whole time, and I've got to call them out how many ever times during the semester. But I ban technology in my classes, and I never really get complaints about it. And I do think after the nature walks, I have the students write a lot of reflective essays just because I think writing helps clarify thinking so much. And I do have them say things like, it was really amazing to be unplugged from my phone for 15 minutes, which always surprises me, but they inevitably, my classes are about 50 students, and inevitably students say that it's been good. So I don't know if it has long-term effects or, I've never studied anything like that, but I definitely have had largely positive responses to making that kind of a requirement. And I do think it creates, granted, I get comments, don't ban technology in your classes, we're college students, we can manage it, that kind of thing. And maybe it's not the right decision for me to do that. I'm not really sure. It's just kind of my one little attempt to maybe help them think a little bit about their, general kind of pattern of being so dependent on that. But I'm not sure if it has long-term impacts, but I definitely get positive feelings when I require them to disconnect a little bit. And I think it maybe makes them think a bit about it, but I'm not sure I can say much more than that. I wish I could. I wish I knew more.
Other questions or comments?
I just want to thank everyone so much for participating in this, and it's such an important topic. I know it's one that's close to my own heart, but I feel that it's such an incredibly important topic right now. And I also just want to say one more, the questions around, the issues of different perceptions and thinking about Black and brown experiences of nature, white experiences of nature. A book that I just finished during the pandemic that was one of the best books I've read in quite a while is Carolyn Finney's Black Faces, White Spaces. And she's actually a visiting professor at Middlebury College, where my daughter was a first-year student this year. And I had been meaning, that was just a confluence of randomness, but I've been meaning to read her book for quite a while. And it's a wonderful, wonderful book, specifically talking about differences in perceptions and experiences, and her love of the natural world as an African-American environmental scholar. And it's just a wonderful, wonderful book that kind of brings together nature writing, scholarship of different human values, perceptions of nature, And so I would highly recommend that to all of you. So I just want to say that. And please, I hope you will reach out with any questions or further comments or ideas that you have for me. My email, I can share my screen again, or maybe you have it already, but I'll share my screen here a minute with my email on it. So thank you.
Maybe you could paste it in the chat, Gretel.
Oh, right. Okay. Let's see if I can do that here.
Because that way we'll be able to, people can actually save their chat text. I don't know if people are aware of that feature in Zoom where you can,
Right.
there's a little ellipsis at the bottom next to where you type that says save chat.
Speaking of that, Bill, where does it save to? Because I quickly did it before the
In your
group
Finder.
ended. My what?
Oh yeah, yeah, I see that now.
Where?
I'm not clear on that, Susan. I think it is either like your downloads folder or in your Zoom. There's like a Zoom folder that's created, but we can look into that.
If you have a Mac, it goes in your Finder, lower left-hand corner.
Oh, on the Zoom?
Yeah.
Okay, so I see Gretel's email, vanwe12@msu.edu. Thank you for being generous with your time and your contact information. We are very thankful to you for sharing a workshop with us today. And we hope to see you. It looks like we're becoming friends, Quakers and you. So you may be hearing from us again.
Wow, thank you.
I'm going to go ahead and turn off the recording now.